Hey, how's it going? This is Chris from Audio Discovery, and today we have Nathan Phelps. What's your it's noted, right? Is your
Yeah, the noted newsletter, exactly.
right. So you got a noted newsletter. I met you via Reddit. You had posted a one of your newsletter contents on it, and I was completely just it was super useful, and it was something where you were inviting people for a month to practice and essentially set up a practice regimen and have it where it's like very detailed, descriptive to oneself about what they should be practicing. And then, it was kind of like you were encouraging throughout that. So that's how I came across. I had chatted you through the Reddit app, and then I just wanted to have you on the channel just to describe the process and just sort of pick your brain on some practice stuff when it comes to music. So Nathan, welcome. Thank you so much for being on the channel. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for having me on. I'm really excited to kind of dirt out about practicing, because that's been something that I just fell in love with doing, pretty recently. So I'm really happy that you were able to do some of the April practice challenge. How many days did you get in, if you don't mind me asking? How many did you do?
So I actually got in, I was pretty good. Like I'd say maybe I got wind of the post, I think mid-month. And so I was already on a sort of deep dive to learn Appetite for Destruction.
Cool.
Through and through. So hence the Marshall
X. Yeah.
Yeah,
I say it's coming together right now. It's coming
right.
together.
Yeah, I've been a fan since I was like 7 years old. I used to
Cool.
play a tennis racket in front of a mirror thinking that I was Slash, draping a
Dude, I would do the same thing. I grew up with like the Christian version of MTV, but I did the same thing with like a tennis racket before I had a guitar, just like jamming out to like Living Sacrifice and these little kind of like Christian metal bands, man.
Right.
So great.
Yeah. And so anyways, I got probably, I'd say I practiced pretty much every day. And I was going methodically from one song, and I would, a lot of it was just transcription, just like sitting down, listening. Yep. And I have the benefit of having a DAW where I can sort of scoop out, I could filter out like certain frequencies and just listen. I started out, with the Andy Aladort, I think it was Cherry Lane book. Cheers to Andy Aladort, but unfortunately, I think that he just didn't have the same tools that we have now. We're able. So yeah. I was started off, and you may have seen on the channel. The Sweet Child of Mine, I was playing it per the music, and it just never sounded right. So I just said, you know what, I'm just gonna go and deep dive everything. So I was in the middle of that. I saw your post, and I was like, all right, you know what? Here we go. I'm with you on this. Let's do it.
This is it. Yeah, I've never gone through Appetite for Destruction, but I should do that. There's so many classic solos on that record. But that's the thing to do, man, is like you can't always trust. I mean, God knows you can't trust tabs, but like when it comes to even books, sometimes, like you gotta listen to your intuition in your ear. If you're sitting there like playing this part over and over again, and it just doesn't sound right, just pull up the record and then just like record yourself and listen to the record, record yourself, listen to the record. And like eventually they will come together and you go, that's it. And then you just chase that, that's the best way to do it.
Well, also too, one of the things that I think that is really interesting about transcription, and I'd love your thoughts on this, is when you transcribe, you're sort of listening in for things that are relevant to you. So a lot of what I was listening to Slash and kind of keying in on, it was like what I learned was his application of just the like blues. He is a blues lick library, and everything that he's doing is just basically like, well, this is lesson one. This is what, there's a phrase that he does in Welcome to the Jungle where he does this thing that I've heard in a Dave Gilmour, that I've heard Dave Gilmour do in the third track of The Wall, Another Brick in the Wall, but it's the one where he's just kind of doing like that little, it goes like track 3, track 4, and then actually track 5 is what you hear on the radio. And it just kind of taught me the how Slash uses that same phrase in his application and with his rhythmic, the way that he interprets rhythm and the way that he interprets the beat. So kind of wanted
no,
you to leave that as a jumping point.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think I think what you're kind of getting at is I feel like there's just like this not misnomer, but like there's this misconception that to get better at guitar, you have to get more theoretical, right? You have to get more jazzy in some ways, which is like, that is not true, because like you can have, some of the best guitarists in the world, again, use like 5 notes and some quarter tones. I'm talking about like the BB Kings and like the Junior Kimbroughs who just like lived in the major pentatonic, and there's no shame in that. And I feel like there's a lot of guitarists especially, but all types of musicians who just like, they hear these kind of like, this dissonance, and you're kind of like, in order to be cool, I have to, incorporate this dissonance. And that's not necessarily true. It's genre dependent, I mean, ultimately. And so with transcription, I think you're doing exactly the right thing, which is that whenever you're transcribing, like you're learning a solo, but you're looking like, what are the kind of like little cells of things that I can kind of like take out of this, you know what I mean? And so I think like the example, the rhythmic, whatever motif you're talking about with that, you can say like, okay, this is something that I know Slash does a lot. This is a part of Slash's language, his vocabulary. I'm going to isolate that. And then those things that you really, really latch onto, like that's the stuff that you want to transpose into different keys and across different parts, especially on guitar, specifically like different parts of the instrument, because like it's really easy on guitar to learn a lick in one spot and then you can't play it anywhere else, know, and then and then like, when are you going to use it? And you're much more likely to forget it, right? So like isolating those things is super cool. And what's awesome about that too, is you can take one little tidbit like that and you can extrapolate it into all sorts of things. So you could like say like, okay, I have this 5-note, pentatonic run. And I know he does like, accent on the 3rd beat and it starts on like, who knows, like the 6th degree, whatever. You can take that and then say like, okay, what if I swapped these 2 notes? Or what if I incorporated an extra, 8th note at this point? And you can kind of like take that one cell and then turn it into all of these sorts of things. And that's how you kind of ingrain that mentality and that feel. And then it just becomes something that becomes a part of your language. And then you do it without thinking. And that's when, you've kind of mastered and put it into your repertoire,
Yeah. You said something early on in that whole thing. I mean, it's just that is, I mean, that could just be the video right there. And I think anybody who watched it would just get a ton from that. So I think that the one of the key things was that, I've chased all through my my playing history. I've chased, going from Guns N' Roses, then into Metallica, then into like Dream Theater, then into like some of like I don't know if there's like this death metal band, but they're like they have like this jazz thing called Cynic. Okay, and their guitar player, Paul Masvidal, the guy is insane. The guy is incredible. And he just comes up with these phrases that are otherworldly, and you're kind of like, wow, where did you come up with the idea or just the the thought to play that? And I what I've decided to do was to sort of transcribe everything, but I also now I have sort of like my own vocabulary, and my vocabulary doesn't include that stuff as much as it's still just kind of back to the the roots of my rock, the rock roots, because expanding and I mean, there's aspects of that where I can hear, okay, a diminished chord, which doesn't or like a diminished flavor doesn't necessarily sound like it fits there, but I'm like, okay, well, but that's kind of part of the stuff that I start to pull in. And the question to you is that how how would you bring in like some like new vocabulary into your playing that way? What's the most effective way?
Yeah, for sure. I think you're touching on a really interesting point, which is something I've had a lot of existential thoughts on, which is like, can you escape your influences? Like, can you really dig yourself out if you want to, of like the 12 years probably when you were a kid, where you were learning all of these records that you loved at the time, but maybe you don't love in the same way, like your default vocabulary. How can you, one, expand it, but like, is it possible to kind of rewrite it? And I don't know. Like, it's really, really difficult. And I don't think you necessarily should, but I feel like I'm kind of talking about like the shame of not being like, quote unquote, like what's cool. I think there's also some shame around like your, like what you decided to learn when you were a kid that like educated the way you sound. Like, for example, like for me, I like cut my teeth on John Frusciante, you know, like that is like who, like from the Chili Peppers. So it's just like Stadium Arcadium, like, you know, all day, all night. And I still adore, you know, Frusciante, but I don't really listen to the Chili Peppers anymore. But now I am like really, really trying to learn jazz, you know, and it's really interesting because like my default is just like rock, you know what I mean? So when I step into like the phrasing, the kind of improv mindset, it's really, really tough to like get out of these kind of like default licks. And so what I found the most success in, like with the caveat that like it's still something that I'm kind of working through every day, and that's kind of like the idea behind the newsletter, is just like sharing, you know, my struggles and also my wins, and just kind of talking about like, hey, like I'm in this with you. Like I am not like, there are very few people that can like master multiple genres, and I think there's a very strong argument for really only focusing on one if you can. But that's also like at that point you kind of don't explore as much of the beauty of an instrument that you may want, but all depends on your goals, which we can get into, you know, later on. But like with transcription specifically, and kind of adding to your vocabulary, it's what we were mentioning a second ago. It's really, really isolating, taking that time. But there's a couple different aspects within that I think make it way more likely to stick around in your playing. So one thing that I talked about in a blog I wrote is just the idea of incorporating as many senses as possible, which is kind of strange, but it has to do with like relating it to the actual act of language learning. And so
that was the polyglot one, right?
Exactly.
I'm sorry.
Exactly. So no, you're fine. But that's exactly right. So the idea is basically like, look, not only do you want to like be cerebrally there and like using your ear, but you also want to use like your literal voice and try to treat it like an instrument. So what I like to do when I'm transcribing is like, I'll listen to a passage, I'll find something I really like, and then the first thing I try to do is just sing it. And just get it over and right back to where like I know it's internalized in my head, because that's what everyone says, right? You want to get what's in your head out your instrument and make that kind of passageway seamless, right? And so like, but a lot of people never actually use their voice because they're like, well, I can't really sing. Well, it's not really about your tone of voice. It's literally about the fidelity of like the pitches that you're hitting and the rhythm. And you can also use your voice, you know, with like more nuance, that kind of thing. So first thing is just like be able to like sing it. Second step is if you can like get the chords underneath, especially as guitarists, this changes depending what instrument you play. But if you can provide, you know, melodic or harmonic context, sing it over the chords, because then you know like, okay, this is how it's sitting on top of the chords. Like, so maybe you kind of you pay attention to where like, okay, this riff starts in kind of like halfway through the measure on like this one chord, like a C chord or whatever, and then it goes to like an E minor, but he hits maybe like the E on like the end of the four going into, you get like context for where the riff is. And then you play it on your instrument, and you get it as good as you can. And what I mean by that, it's not just the notes, it's not just the rhythm, it's everything about it. So I think a lot of people will do that and they'll go like, okay, well, I have the rhythm, I have the melody, I can kind of play it, but it doesn't really sound like it, but I learned it, right? Like, no, like if you actually want to like get it in your vocabulary, you need to get all of the little nuances, you know what I mean? I mean, like down to like the way they do the vibrato, and like especially with like the pacing of the rhythm, because like, you know, the I think I have to talk about is like pocket, right? Which is like, where are you at on the beat? But like, you're trying to make it to where you play the record, you don't even hear yourself, right? It's just so ingrained in it. And then once you do that, this is the kind of like the really extra step, like that makes it, I think, the most beneficial is the transposition. Because then you say like, okay, I have this idea in this key, in this context. And now I'm going to take it, I'm going to put it in a key I don't really like to play it, or I'm going to put it in a different spot. And what that does is that makes you, one, you have to leave the record at that point. You're on your own. You know what I mean? Like you can't, because at that point you're off of the record because that's in a different key. So you're transposing it in that way. And that makes you focus on like the scale degrees and kind of like the kind of like the bare infrastructure of the lick. And then you sing it in that key, you know, and you kind of get that. And then you ideally you sing it over the chord. And you only can't really have time to do that for licks you really, really, really like, which is kind of my point. You need to be careful about like what you choose to incorporate to that degree.
Right.
But when you find something you're like, that is so freaking cool, like that's what you want to take, you transpose, and that's the way to do it, man. That is
Oh, nice, nice. Did you ever watch so Guthrie Govan had this explanation of finding like sort of the scale degrees and understanding scale degrees of in not just necessarily like you know, tonic, subtonic, median, you know, supertonic, whatever. Like he actually was just like play the note, you know, compared to, you know, to the tonic, you know, play the, you know, whichever the intervals are, and just learn them, you know, learn how they make you feel. Did you ever get a chance to see that?
I think I watched that a while ago, so I couldn't give you specific commentary on it. But what you're saying, like, I'm like, okay, I'm remembering some of this, you know?
Yeah. And so it was very instructive because it kind of pulled me out of, I learned a lot of the, you know, the modes and whatnot by, you know, using patterns, you know, and I would just like, oh, okay, cool. Well, you know, if I'm here, then I can use this pattern. And then there are certain licks that sort of lend themselves, that pattern lends itself to sort of like a guitar ergonomics, which is something that I think is really interesting and something I kind of wanted to explore in a later video. But like a guitar ergonomics, you get a pull off, you know, that's a certain subdivision, you know, not subdivision, sorry, it's a certain interval pattern, right? And so I was so firmly in that lane when I heard what he said about studying the intervals based on, you know, how they interact. You have the leading note, which is, you know, your major seventh will lead you to your tonic, or you have the, you know, you'll sit firmly if you have a, you know, if you end on your dominant or whatever, right? So that practicing using, you know, say for instance, you know, maybe you strum a chord, you go and you like, all right, well, let me play notes, and instead of me thinking of, you know, I will play, you know, this pattern, don't play the pattern, play a succession of notes that will land you on, say for instance, a dominant or on a median or on something, you know, where you're thinking of it, not just like, okay, yeah, this pattern sounds cool. Because I used to do that all the time, and it would just sound like noodling.
Right.
Where it's like, okay, no, the melody is actually, you know, obviously you want a nice melody, you know, you're incorporating rhythm, you're incorporating, but also keep in mind that you can use these other textures and other flavors as just that. You know, you can say, yeah, I'm going to use, you know, a note that is out of, you know, out of the triad, or out of, you know, you can take those passing notes and use them as means of taking that tension and then releasing the tension.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, I think you're getting at the idea of kind of target tones, you know, in general, which is like obviously a pretty fundamental component of what they teach in jazz improv, right? Which is basically like, you know, if you have the classic like 2-5-1, you know, harmonic progression, you're basically, you know, when you're doing these licks, you're kind of thinking about what are the kind of key tones that are always going to sound the most like that chord, and that's usually the 1, the 3, and the 7, right? And you're kind of like basically building runs that are targeting those things, and you could do that either diatonically or outside of the key, right? So if like a diatonic example would be like, okay, I want to land on the 5th of C, which would be G, right. Maybe I'll start, you know, on like the major 7, and I'll walk down like B, A, G, which would just be like 7, 6, 5, right? That would be an example of like a diatonic walk down to land on your target tone, which is the fifth, you know, at whatever point. And usually you want to do that on like the quote unquote like strong beats, which are like usually like the 1 and the 3, I believe.
Right.
Is what they say a lot. So that's kind of like one mentality you could take. And then at that point, you know, you could do that with anything outside. So you could do like, there's like one of the classic things is chromatic surround tones, you know, where like you just dance around the target tone, but you can just do that chromatically from like anywhere you want. But like, this is kind of getting at more broadly, like something that my guitar teacher told me was basically just like, look, like you can make anything sound good if you have like the integrity and the balls to like play it like you mean it. You know what I mean? What that means is like the rhythmic and melodic kind of just precision, in the sense that like you were owning it. And you could like, it's like there's one I posted, I think in the 7 Lessons blog that I wrote, where basically Victor Wooten is playing with the music, I think is Win, I forget his channel, but he's basically like, look, we're gonna play like a one dominant, you know, riff, like a funk riff in like E or whatever. He's like, I'm going to play so strongly and out of key that you're going to be the one that sounds out of key, right? And that's kind of the point. Like, I'm going to make you sound wrong, even though I'm the one playing out of key.
Right.
And that's kind of the point, which is just like, you can make any note, any interval really sound good. And that's kind of I think that's a dangerous lesson to learn too early on, because in order to really make that work is you have to have respect for kind of harmonic conventions and how those things work, and understand tension and release. But once you do, really anything goes, which is kind of terrifying. It's like jumping off a diving board where you're like, all right, I could literally do whatever I want.
Right.
But more often than not, unless it's in the right hands, that's going to sound like shit.
Sure. Yeah.
The other defense.
But to a different end. And one of the reasons, like I love collaboration. And one of my favorite things is within collaboration is making the other instrumentalists sound good, you know, like as an accompaniment. And so if you have enough awareness and understanding of how strong you play or how much you carry, you know, because I spent a long time as a bass player in bands where it's like, okay, well, you know what, I'm driving, you know, I'm the driving force of what's happening, because the drummer's got a certain, you know, he's got a pulse, he's doing his thing, whatever, and then this guitar player has a different, you know, and so bridging the gap between the two, you know, that's where I come. But I also can highlight, if the drummer's doing something, I can highlight that, and I can highlight something that the guitar player is doing. And because I have enough of an identity, you know, where I can sort of bridge that, I'm saying, okay, yeah, you know what, you're playing this thing, and I can signal a change with a, you know, some kind of ascending line or something where it's like, you know, kind of like a choppy line that's going to land at a point where the guitar player is going to do his thing. You know, I felt that my awareness of that was able to sort of say, like, here we've got, you know, the strength of my voice within the, you know, the bass instrument within the band is going to be able to sort of bridge these two, you know, because when we would play, you know, we would feed off of, we would sort of play not necessarily in unison, but we would play off of each other and be able to say, like, you know, but everything works because we're, you know, there's sort of like a bridge element, you know.
Right. Exactly. I think that's like one of the coolest bits about collaboration in general. And like jazz is obviously one of the coolest examples of that. Like, I don't want to, you know, go too down the jazz rabbit hole, but like, for an example that I think is cool, because like with bass players, like I love that kind of interplay, and I think it's so important to listen in that instance. Like, even if you have like, it's little things like you have like 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, and that, like, that's just a regular group, but then the bass starts going 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, you know, and then like then the drummer will adapt to that different rhythm and kind of like imply it. Like all of those little things that are happening in the moment are so cool, right?
Yeah.
And it's the same thing with like with jazz, for example. Like, you know, if you're in the middle of a solo and you know, the soloist starts, you know, throwing in a bunch of maybe like the flat 13, for example, basically just like an interval that is maybe a little bit stanky, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And then you'll hear, like on records, you'll hear the pianist, for example, who's comping. They'll like throw in the same interval because like they're like, oh, he's doing that, I'm gonna give him like a little bit more of that and like let him know I'm listening, you know?
Right. Yeah.
And that's like, I mean, that's why so many people like adore jazz, is because you have those are like the spontaneous moments between players. And like, man, you can't get like, it doesn't get much cooler than that. No. Like that's when you feel like locked in. And that is like one of the most beautiful feelings that you can have as a musician, is when like you're in a moment and you're on the stage and you're playing, and then you just have something that clicks and you both turn around, you just grin because you're just like, yeah. we just locked in, you know. It's such a good feeling.
Yeah, definitely. So so kind of, I wanted to, you know, we're kind of getting really into a lot of great stuff in terms of like you know, theory and whatnot, whatever. So I kind of wanted to I think that if you look at a sort of a bird's eye view of your site, you know, I think that you have a defined philosophy of practice, of instrumentation. And I know I'm kind of hitting that sort of broad, you know, I want you to think about it, but that's what I'm asking about. Broadly, what is your sort of overall philosophy of, you know, I guess if you can summarize your philosophy within, you know, talking about practice and I guess and instrumentation.
Sure. Yeah, well, I think the reason I started writing about this and thinking a lot more clearly about this is because I feel like, you know, the beginning stages of any instrument are fairly well defined. This also switches depending upon your genre. For example, in classical music, is incredibly defined and rigorous and academic in nature. And then, for example, like saxophonists seem to have a very, very good like pedagogy attached to them, no matter like almost all the saxophones players I know are like freaking awesome.
Right.
And like, it's like, for whatever reason, like they, as an instrument, that family has like done such a good job with practicing. But like with guitar in particular, it felt like the Wild West, especially like growing up in the internet age, you know, like we're all just like doomed to like tabs and like some dude in your hometown who liked Ozzy Osbourne, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And like, that's fine, but there just wasn't like the infrastructure I feel like that other instruments had. And so like, I don't think this is exclusive to guitar. I think it's particularly a pain point in guitar, but I feel like there's a point where once you cross the threshold of a beginner into intermediate and you kind of like are into the semi-professional land, at that point, you're kind of just dropped off. Like, it's like, you know, like in the ocean when like, there's like the tipping point where everything just like drops away.
Yeah.
You're kind of like left out in the open, especially if you don't decide to go to school, which is obviously incredibly expensive and like sometimes not even worth it. You have everything in the world to practice. So what do you practice?
Right.
You know what I mean? So it's like, you have everything.
Yeah.
And that is like overwhelming, and that can be like paralyzing. And I found that to be very paralyzing. And so my philosophy with this is basically like, how can we like figure out how to chart our own way? Because like what the reason why it's amazing and that there's everything to practice and also damning is like, it's all dependent on what you want to do. But I feel like there's so much pressure to be like, oh, well, jazz is cool. Like I remember I didn't even like jazz when I first started learning jazz, right? I just thought it was cool to do.
Sure.
And then I fucking love jazz, and like I have a different passion for it. But I should never have like, you know, started learning it in the first place just because I felt pressure to. So basically, my philosophy is the first thing you need to do is figure out what the hell you want to sound like. What do you, and not even sound like, but like, why are you playing in the first place, right? Is it to be a professional? Is it to be a studio professional? Is it to be a live player? Like, okay, within that, what kind of player do you want to sound like? Do you want to be a bread and butter, like really, really kind of simple minimalist player? Or do you want to be like an incredibly complex, virtuosic, you know, kind of metal player? Do you want to be a Wes Montgomery jazz style player? You know, like just like make some decisions, right? I feel like a lot of people are like, well, I want to learn how to play like funk. I want to learn how to play jazz. I want to know how to play blues. And like all of those take a lifetime, and you might not even master a single one of those in a lifetime. So my first thing is like, we need to get a lot better about just saying like, I want to sound like this, and own it. And don't care what other people think. Know that that's just what you want to sound like. Once you decide that, then you say, well, what's a goal within that? Maybe, for example, like I'll use myself as an example. Like I just love Kind of Blue. No shame. Like the most famous jazz record of all time. No shame. Right. If there's one type of jazz I want to play, it's cool jazz. So, okay, I want to learn how to play cool jazz. Okay, cool. Well, then what are my favorite records from that? Okay, Kind of Blue, for example. Okay, well then what's a 3-month goal? Maybe I learn 3 songs off of Kind of Blue in their entirety. Okay, well then what's like a 1-month goal? Okay, well maybe I learn So What? Okay, well what's a 1-week goal? Well, maybe I learn Miles Davis's first chorus solo over that, and I take that, and then in my practice session I can go, okay, well I know the song is in Dorian. It does a lot of chordal movements in Dorian. Okay, I'm going to drill Dorian scales for X amount of time. I'm going to kind of warm up and make sure I feel really comfortable with the chords in this song, and then I'm going to start transcribing, and I'm going to start listening. And like that is, if you zoom all the way out, right? It's kind of like you're here, it's really, really tiny, and then you keep going back, and it's all going toward what you want to actually do. And you know, like every practice session that it's heading toward that goal. And what that does is that makes it way more motivating to actually practice. Because like I feel like a lot of people are like, oh, practicing is boring. Well, it's like you're probably practicing the wrong thing because you don't actually want to sound like that. So usually that tension is just because you haven't defined what the hell you actually want to do and what you actually want to sound like. If you're not having fun practicing something, chances are you shouldn't be practicing because you don't actually want to learn it, which means you won't remember it. Right. So like that's kind of like, and these are all lessons that I just like discovered through just like literal pain and like existential depression and just being like, man, like I really wish I could like redefine my relationship with guitar. And then I started to do that. And I was like, God, if I had known this stuff when I was 19, 18, like I'm 28 now, like if I had known this stuff a decade ago, I would be a demonstrably better guitar player, like by a mile. Right. And so I want to save people some of that heartache, some of that time, and just so they can have fun and like also know like when they practice, they're like, okay, like I feel like I couldn't have done a better job. Like I'm going as quickly as I can. And that's kind of that's why I started writing. And that's the idea.
Yeah, man, that like, I mean, I think that it's such great utility to know what you want to do. Then you have a direction, and that I think, when I was learning metal, it was very easy because, metal is sort of, it's a very like kind of all encompassing, people who are into metal, they're just into metal, and they may have like, other, thoughts or whatever, but metal is kind of its own, its own pursuit, it's like, where it's like unapologetic. If you're not into anything else but metal, it's unapologetic in that sense. And it's very clear that you can sort of follow that, where it's like, I think with other genres, particularly with pop, particularly with, it's because they pull from so many different influences, is you end up with all of these like, because within blues, you're also having some classical influences, within jazz, you have classical influences within, where you're able, or with pop, you have all of these different influences. So it's like, I remember, one of the things you said that really resonated with me was the fact that, when sorry, I'm coming up with a blank because I wanted to start that off well.
You're good.
But I know that when I started out, and I wanted to learn all of these different types of music in order to sort of influence my own playing. And to some degree it's been useful. But when I have conversations with people that are like, well, what should I practice? And how do I do this thing and blah, 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 whatever. And it's like, the chief thing, and the thing that I had the most, that I resonated with the most, is having fun with it. And I've never with if it's drums, bass, guitar, or composing or music production, I've always ever had fun with it.
Right.
and I always find something that I like. And there's a video that I did on EQ, and I named it like rambly, rambly thoughts on EQ. And the main thing was that I for some reason, I like the idea that I'm using, on the screen, because I can't afford one, but like I'm using like a pool tech, like like an EQ, like a fancy EQ that's, thousands of dollars if I were to own a hardware version. But here I've got this, version, I bought for like $50, bought the license for. And now, but in my mind, I'm thinking, here's this mixing engineer, and this guy would have reached for this thing, and I put myself into that. So I'm having a little bit of like playtime. I'm having a little bit of fun with it,
Right.
And I think that it's really important in terms of, finding the things, the why. A lot of the why is just like, dude, what got you up in the morning? What were you listening to that you went like, yeah, like, if there's something that you've heard. And that, for me, going over, and I've listened to that stupid record for years. I mean, must have, that my digital stylus is wearing out, and,
Appetite?
Yeah, Appetite,
Yeah.
And same with Zeppelin 4. I can listen to Zeppelin 4 front to back without needing, without like coming up for air.
Yeah.
I can, but on repeat, I will listen to, God forbid, Stairway to Heaven. I will listen to that every day. I don't care. I love it. I love Black Dog. I love rock and roll. I love Battle of Evermore. I mean, all of these songs, but when I play them, when I'm learning them, when I'm deconstructing them, it's out of love. It's out of this like, oh my God, I love this thing so much that I really want to understand it from its roots.
Right.
So yeah, I think is sort of one of the things that I also have seen within the students that I've taught, where it's like, look, because my philosophy is, what do you like? I would walk in and they would say, I want to learn guitar. Okay. What song do you want to learn?
Exactly. Yeah.
And then all of the theory, everything will just, all the theory will happen. You'll learn everything that you need to know about music by learning the songs that you love.
Right. Exactly. And on that point, like I guess I should say to kind of, you do need to make decisions, because I feel like at some point, like you can definitely be the jack of all trades and the master of none. And that's kind of what I'm trying to caution against.
Sure.
But the flip side of that is like, you should chase what you're saying, what motivates you.
Yep.
Because whatever music you are adoring at the moment, like take that and use it, in your practice. You know what I mean? If you're just like obsessed with the record, you're like, God, how do they do this? Well, you just found what you're going to learn next.
Yeah.
Like it's just that simple. And like, I think a lot of people get worried about,
what they're losing by doing, kind of like the what do they call that, the cost,
opportunity cost.
Opportunity cost.
Yeah, opportunity, absolutely. So like, there's some of that where it's like, okay, if I go all in on this even for a short period of time, like am I missing out on something? Exactly. And it's just like, no, that's kind of foolish. Or some people think like, well, if I learn something too much, I will sound like them and then I won't sound like myself, you know what I mean? Which, to be honest, like the vast majority of people never get good enough to really be a good enough copycat. And then I feel like the people beyond that, like you inevitably seep up, depending on what you're listening to, like, and no one's interests are exactly alike. So I think that is just like a fallacy, and like it's just something that you just do not need to worry about. Just like learn what motivates you, and you're not going to like become like I'm going to shit on Joe Bonamassa for a second. You know what I mean? Like, I just think like he has his own thing, but in the ways he does sound derivative, right? But like, sure. On the flip side, playing like him would be amazing. You know what I mean? So it's kind of like, you just got to run for it, and you just got to practice. So like, do make decisions, do focus in, because there is a lot of evidence behind the idea that like, if you spread yourself too thin, if you have too many goals at one time, you will not really make the progress that you want to make. So you have to make decisions, you have to prioritize,
right?
But prioritize what motivates you.
Right. Yeah. And the thing about the, Joe Bon is like, I mean, as derivative as it may sound, there's people who are, my brother, he went to one of his shows. He came back, was like, hey, dude, this show was great. He was awesome. And, and it's like,
Right.
yeah, he's a great player,
He's a
and
complete pro.
and it's guy's he's going to take all of the things that were sort of that are derivative, right? And sorry to hit on that point. I know it's not necessarily something that you wanted to make it a sticking point, but I do agree that to some extent, and I grew up with a lot of guys that were like, man, this idea is a ripoff. It's like, okay, but I'm 17 when I wrote it, and it doesn't mean that it's the only thing that I'm ever going to write.
Right.
And so don't worry about whether or not it's a ripoff, but if you play it and you own it, it's yours. Own it.
Right.
And that's it.
Right.
So I think that, the wherewithal to say, this is what I'm going to do. And if it is a Frusciante, Frusciante was a huge Jimmy fan. He could play Jimmy back and forth, and you hear it. You hear it. But when you put that along with Chad Smith and with Flea, it's amazing, because Chad Smith and Flea are amazing. And then you've got this Hendrix influence, which is amazing, and everything. It's just a, like, I feel like, yeah, you can be derivative, but you're going to be the sum, or you're going to be the part of a whole different sum.
Right.
And all you need to do is just key into the things that you love to do. And the same thing extrapolates for drums, for bass, for mixing, for, even for any kind of art, any kind of, anything anybody wants to do, just do that to the extent that you feel the most, that you feel the most, from it, and it'll take care of itself.
Exactly. And so to bring it from like a kind of like, kind of metaphysical, psychological element back down to like the pragmatic too,
right.
Like what you can do with that is, like, I find that, like, I used to practice technical exercises because I thought I should be practicing technical exercises. Right. So like, okay, I need to run, a scale in thirds at like 110 beats per minute in like F Lydian, whatever.
Right.
And I wouldn't have a reason why I was doing that. It was just kind of like, I feel like I should. I read a blog that somewhere that said that I should do this,
Right.
And the result of that is that I had never had fun, and I never really did that much of it. And I would always just opt for other things. So what's the solution there? Because technical exercises are incredibly important. And what do you do? Again, you tie it back to whatever you're learning, kind of what you're saying about like what song, and then the theory will come, right? In the sense of, like, for example, in So What, there's a lick that runs up in fourths, essentially. And it kicked my ass when I was like working on it. And I was like,
sounds really hard.
I was like, why am I struggling so hard with this particular lick? And I'm like, well, it's in fourths, and my fingers apparently aren't used to playing this type of run in fourths. So what do? You take that, and then you're like, that's what you put in your technical exercise. You go, I need to run scales in fourths, starting on different scale degrees, because I had so much trouble learning this lick. Right. And then it's directly applied to the music you're trying to learn. And then next time you come across a lick that's using fourths, you'll be like, I'm ready. You know what I mean? Because you actually like practice that for a reason. Like that's the secret to like getting your technical exercises to actually be entertaining.
Yeah. So say, for instance, because I'm trying to think, working with fourths, something like that, you're kind of, the ergonomics of that are so off, right? Because if you're trying to work with fourths, particularly, I mean, because the guitar is tuned to fourths, it's almost like you're just kind of, strumming stuff out, right? But I feel like, you would take essentially like, all right, well, here's the ergonomic, here's a shortcut. Let me exploit the shortcut. Right. So that way you're like, okay, because I feel like anytime you learn something, you have to kind of take it into like, all right, let me translate it into like something that I would sort of naturally do.
Right.
Because that's where person gets Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, no, yeah. No, sorry, I was going to jump off what you're saying with like the technicality aspect of it. What made me think about this is one, the thing I want to point out is like, you do not have to learn exclusively licks and music of your own instrument. Right. So like, for example, like on So What, I'm learning trumpet solos, I'm learning saxophone solos because I just love the way they sound. But there is tension there where there are times where like I'm learning There Is No Greater Love, which is like this Sonny Stitt song that I was working on with my teacher. And there's just like these insane like saxophone runs, you know, like the classic like jazz, like 30-second note, just blitz, you know, of notes. And like they're not physically impossible on guitar, but like it's just the way that the instrument is and the way they're able to access those notes is like a lot easier in particular intervals. And so with guitar, it's a little tricky because like, again, there are multiple places that you can play something. So you write with fourths. It's like, okay, if you're on like the 5th fret of the G string and the 5th fret of the, you know, the B string, you're gonna have G and C, right? Just right there, which is your 4th, right? And you could just run that up. But the thing is that doesn't become actually like efficient at all to play anything in any sort of speed, because you actually need to be staying in like almost like a single, maybe 1 or 2 positions. And that might be something you're not used to. But then again, there's your exercise. You know what I mean? Like, don't just do like your classic guitar move. See if you can make it sound like a saxophone. See if you can make it sound like a trumpet and play it in a different position that is ergonomically more efficient and effective for that particular passage, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. So we're going to come up on a hard stop for you, man. You know, so we got about 5 minutes left. So, I mean, we just blazed through this time. Oh my God.
Yeah, we totally did.
And I'd love to have you on again. I mean, we could kind of delve into some more of these concepts that you're talking about. I mean, I feel like you really have a lot of thoughts on the matter that, you know, you're sharing obviously on your noted newsletter. You know, and then also you have a site as well.
Yeah. So the site is weallpractice.com, and then the newsletter, you can find it on there, or you can just do weallpractice.com like /noted. But yeah, so right now that is the primary place where I'm putting all my thoughts. Like I do have a blog, but that's just for like SEO stuff, and I do have you know, some other things I'm kind of up to, but really like the newsletter is the main kind of baby that I'm putting it all out on. Like obviously I post on Reddit, post other places, but it's all pointed back to the newsletter. And like I do have like some products and things I'm trying to develop like that are based in these ideas. But I'm trying to make the newsletter like a standalone, like this is its own free, really super valuable thing. So anything like that, like if you love these kind of conversations, like anyone who wants to sign up, like I would love to have you.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm going to post your link in the description. And then, and then like, in terms of like music stuff that you're doing, are you obviously, you know, kind of coming out of the pandemic, like, are you going to do live stuff? Are you going to do recorded stuff? Like, what's your
So I do a lot of stuff with a band called Pilot Rouge. So it's like the French red, so ROUGE. And that's kind of like an indie rock band, like kind of like local natives type stuff, that kind of thing. And so we're releasing kind of like actually a disco inspired track that we did recently, which is super fun. So I do that. We do a lot of that stuff kind of resides in the background with like sync licensing and that kind of thing. But as far as live shows, oh my God, that'd be great. I'll probably be playing a little bit around Nashville here, you know, when things start getting a little bit more busy. But right now, honestly, I'm just like, I'm still doing a lot of production and writing on the kind of indie rock side, but I'm really just trying to hone in on practicing and learning jazz, and writing this newsletter and kind of exploring these aspects is a little bit out of my comfort zone, but I'm really enjoying the process. So most of my energy is going to there. Like I used to play all sorts of, you know, gigs on Broadway in Nashville, and I would do like the Weekend Warrior stuff, or like, you know, go out on Thursday, come back on Sunday. And I had a blast, and I did that for years and played, you know, like hundreds of those things, but like, it's kind of what motivates you. Like I don't have a desire to really play country music. I don't have a desire to play pop country. I don't have a desire to play a lot of like, I mean, I have a good time in a cover band, but like depending on the cover band. And so my motivations have changed a little bit in that sense. And so, but like Pilot Rouge would be a good place to check out kind of the stuff I do. But honestly, come hang out in the newsletter, because that's like where all the action's happening. Right
on. Yeah. And you did that start in December 2020?
The newsletter?
Yeah.
I think so. That sounds right. I don't remember exactly when it started. We're not too far in. I think I've done like 8 of them.
Okay.
And I did the April practice challenge. But again, these are kind of like, as you know from reading them, like these are like serious pieces of writing. I'm actually thinking about trying to like make them shorter, because like they end up being like a couple thousand words and are like really long-winded, you know, but like I think they're super interesting. But so many people are like, who the fuck is gonna read all this? You know? And
Man.
I'm like, people do. Some people do.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I do think that, like, say for instance, in just, you know, kind of my knucklehead, you know, thought process or whatever. I mean, they're really, in terms of like how deep you go, they really describe the rabbit hole, and they really give you, because I always call it the rabbit hole. You know, you have a 8 notes, but you've got all these different directions you can go. You know, find out how far that rabbit hole goes. You know, think of it, you know, like play them forward, play them backward. You know, intervals, or do groups of 3, and then, you know, 1 back, 3 and then 1 back, and then do 4 and 1 by 5, you know, all that stuff, right? Just find out what you like about it by just finding out all the possibilities. And I think that your newsletter is a really great example of how that of how to think about it in terms of, you know, and I think I can extrapolate that even to other sort of skills and abilities and stuff like that, where it's like, look, you know, it's like kind of like I played high school baseball, and it was like, yeah, you know what, I mean, I was an under, I didn't grow into my body until later, but I loved pitching. So I realized, like, now is that I knew 6 or 7 pitches, you know, and it's like, if you can figure out, okay, what can I do with this, you know, what can I do with this thing, you know, then
no, I mean, to jump off that, the last thing I'll say, I know we're pretty much out of time, but like I took a couple years off of practicing guitar, like when I was just touring and I was like doing different types of things, and like I just kind of lost my love for practice entirely. And that was kind of like a whole moment where I was kind of like kind of placing like, where does music live in my life, and what does that kind of mean to me? How do I define it? So I had to go through all of this types of like existential kind of questions, that sort of thing, to like reach a spot where like I really enjoyed practicing. But in the interim, I learned how to speak Spanish, and I learned how to cook, and like all of these things. And I got way better at understanding how to learn and how to practice like other things. And to your point, like that was also part of the impetus for like creating this newsletter, and some of the products that I'm working on developing is literally like, can I apply, you know, the Feynman, you know, method and these different heuristics like to music? And it turns out absolutely. And so that's also part of the kind of reason I started doing this.
That's awesome. Nathan, dude, thank you so much for being on the channel. I hate to cut it off, but obviously we had, you know, thing, whatever, but I could talk to you for so long on this, on this subject.
Yeah,
and I love all your thoughts on it too. I mean, you're great. So
yeah, I really appreciate it. No, thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to coming back on.
Sweet. Sounds great. All right. Well, thanks guys. It's been Audio Discovery. Go check Nathan's newsletter down in the description, and we'll see you guys soon. All right.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks.